it's a little bit difficult because one thing that I do get asked sometimes from parents is, what should I say? What are the words? And that's very difficult because there are no perfect words. I've never found them anyway, to tell kids about something difficult or something awkward or something that is changing in their lives. But there are some rules of thumb.
Welcome to Access to Justice. I am your host, Evan Clark from Kahane Law, here with my co-host, as usual, Heather Malarick from Merrick Law. Heather, good morning.
Morning, Evan.
How are you enjoying this lovely April day?
Oh, it's just so nice to see the sun shining. The magpies are building a nest outside of my window. It's going to be a nice, noisy summer. How are you doing?
That's great. I mean, magpies, they like shiny things, right? So, if you start missing jewelry,
great.
Just look out in the nest. It's probably not the children, it's probably the magpies.
Right, yeah.
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I know by the time people are watching this, it won't be April anymore, but one of the nicest things about our long winters here in Edmonton is when they end. It's like, you feel so happy. Oh, the sun, and it's like, I can go outside without wearing a parka, and it's such a lift. You don't get that lift when you live in Arizona. It's like, oh, it's warm.
It remains warm and sunny today.
Yeah.
That's true.
And of course, as usual, our special guest, Kim Mcdonald Kim, where are you from?
I am a financial advisor with Mcdonald Advisory, and the firm I work with is Raymond James. So thank you for having me, Evan. I love participating on your panel and certainly excited about our guest today.
Yeah, me too. Heather, introduce our guest.
Yeah, without further ado, I'm very excited to have Brandy Smith joining us today. Brandy and I and Kim are all registered collaborative professionals, and every time Brandy and I seem to get somewhere together, I just want to pick her brain for such a long time and ask her so many questions. So I'm really excited to have her here and get an opportunity to do that. Brandy is a registered psychologist who's been working as a psychologist for 11 years in Alberta. She's got her master's degree in counseling psychology and works with the wonderful gang over at Creating Solutions. She works with all sorts of clients, including children, youth, adults, and families, and has a particular niche in working with families that are going through separation and divorce. She says her primary focus is on healthy children and healthy family systems, regardless of the current level of conflict. So I'm so excited to have her here today and to ask her some questions. Hi, Brandy. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for coming. Did I miss anything in the bio? Is there anything else you want our listeners to know about you?
Not so much, I think. I think that's a good snapshot of kind of like where things are at right now. Definitely prior to being a psychologist, worked with children and families in a couple different arenas. I've worked in child and family services. I've worked in the healthcare system and whatnot, and always had kind of a little bit of a foot in in a private practice. So it was kind of nice. I believe it was about 8 years ago or so, made the leap to do full-time private practice, and that's just been lovely. So I can kind of design my caseload the way that I like it. So I have a nice balance. I think general practice that I really enjoy, mostly focused on children, but of course, with private practice, you kind of take what comes through the door. So that's been really interesting for me.
So, Brandy, Heather said you help families and children no matter the level of conflict. So does that include no conflict?
Yes, actually, surprisingly enough, it absolutely does. Those are sometimes some of my favorite clients. So I do actually get various parents coming in when they're before they've actually either legally or physically separated, and they're just coming in for information. So it's kind of a little bit more consultative rather than intervention kind of based. But absolutely, it's lovely to sit there and talk with parents who are at the beginning stages and just kind of wanting to do the best that they can and understand their children's development level in order to make good choices. So yeah, I surprisingly get people with zero conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it's just important to note because I think a lot of times if people engaged with somebody like you years or months before they come and see somebody like me, they might never have to meet me in my professional capacity as a family lawyer.
Yeah, sometimes that is the case, right? It's that old phrase, an ounce of prevention is sometimes worth more than a pound of cure. And absolutely, that's something that I find there's some really wonderful research in all sorts of areas of psychology about the need for early intervention and early understanding, information essentially to be able to essentially change the trajectory that could possibly go before patterns start to become really rigid in a family system. So yeah, it's always great to be able to provide information that way or to provide kind of that first initial contact.
So I guess what I'm hearing there, Brandy, is it's never too soon to get someone involved with the family, even if you're just contemplating a divorce or separation. So you could help support them right from the very beginning. Is there kind of a perfect time? Like, is that too soon for people to be doing that? Or is there a good time for you to get involved on a more formal basis?
I don't think there's necessarily a perfect time to be contacted. It's just essentially depending on when somebody is contacting me, either my response or the type of services will probably change. Right. Okay. If I have two parents coming in, so the no conflict example, if I have two parents coming into my office and they're saying, it looks like our marriage is going to be dissolving. We have, two children, these are their ages. We want to know how to introduce this to them, what kinds of things we have to be aware of, the timing of when we're going to tell them, languaging around what we're going to say, like what can we do? That obviously I shouldn't say obviously, but typically what would happen is I would just simply have a conversation. The type of services that they're going to get are going to match what their need is at the time. So I'm probably going to have them, read some resources. I'm going to provide probably websites or books, that kind of thing, that will help them what they need to know. And then usually I say, my door is open, and if anything changes in the future, if you have more questions in the future, please do let me know, and we'll go from there. If families are coming in and they say, we have separated already, this is what it has looked like to date. I think our children are doing okay. However, we want to just kind of make sure. At that point, we talk to them about what the different options are, and may or may not meet with the kids just to kind of gather what they have to say, what their perspectives are, that kind of thing, and give, again, some feedback to the parents. And if you kind of keep going along the continuum, sometimes, we have separated and, our son or daughter is seeming to be struggling. We've gotten some feedback from the teachers at school or whichever. Then that's going to look really different. I might work individually with that child. I might work with the family as a whole, that kind of a thing. And then if you keep moving along the continuum, sometimes there has been, conflict or the children have been under distress or feeling anxious or are having difficulties with change for a period of time, and the parents can't quite see eye to eye on what their origins are, what they should be doing about it, that's when my role gets a little bit more formalized. It might involve, court orders or, orders from justices in regards to kind of what exactly the role needs to be and how decisions are going to be made, et cetera, et cetera. So it really is like it runs the whole gamut. So it's not that there's a perfect time to come. Although I'm highly biased, of course, I'm going to say the earlier the better. But it's really just meeting the family where they're at. If things are more intensive, meeting them with more intensive services, and if things are less intensive, meeting them there. Yeah.
I often get the comment or sort of the feedback that people are pretty overwhelmed, it seems to me, often when they're, contemplating separation or going through it. And they also have sort of additional time responsibilities, stresses, money. So, if I'm talking to a parent or a parent is listening to this, is there anything that you would recommend that they be sort of either watching for in themselves or in their kids that would be a bit of a marker of like, if you're thinking about seeing a psychologist, but you're not sure, these are the things that you want to be maybe watching for, and that would be a reason to definitely reach out. Like I hear you saying, like, I think every family can probably benefit from your help, but are there any things that are really like sort of flags that that they should pick up the phone and call someone?
Yeah, and these would be flags that would be for other types of concerns or issues as well, right? Meaning that, with people, if there is a change and there's kind of almost like a reverb effect or changes within the individual that are drastic in either direction, those are usually good cues. So, for example, if you're looking, if you're a parent and, there's been some sort of a change in your family's life, and then you're noticing your child is eating differently, sleeping differently, having a difficult time regulating their emotions. So they tend to react even more so than what would be typical. If they're struggling or having kind of any kind of altercations or conflict with their peers at school, or peers, friends within the community, those are typically the signs that we would show is that they have some underlying stress that just is either overwhelming the system or they're not able to kind of manage, so that they're not able to manage the rest of their day-to-day. I don't know if listeners are familiar with the term fight or flight, but essentially those are all indications that a fight or flight response, a stress-related response, is going on within an individual. And for parents, it's, we're all human, so it's relatively the same. I would ask, are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you able to think clearly and problem solve effectively? Are you able to manage your own emotions and, not kind of have them overwhelm your day-to-day or overwhelm your kind of self-perception? How's your eating? How's your sleeping? All of those good basics that are good indicators that something might not be quite managed well.
Okay.
One thing that I hear, that I certainly hear a lot from clients, I don't know what kind of input you can provide about this, Brandy, is you hear something like, oh, whenever the child comes back from dad's house or the other parent's house, then it takes them like a day or two to calm down. And this is often related to saying they shouldn't be spending so much time with that parent. And that parent is, a bad parent. Well, maybe not a bad parent, but there's something's not right about their parenting. And then, of course, you know what the other party says? The exact same thing.
It's not me, it's them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you hear that as well? And I don't know, what kind of input do you have on that kind of a situation?
Yeah, that is actually a really common occurrence, and there's a couple different things that kind of go on with that. One of the things, and I kind of mentioned at the beginning, I can talk about psychology for so long. There's these two concepts in psychology: correlation and causation. And what ends up happening is, because parents obviously are heavily invested in their children, they want to know what's going on. If there's any concerns, they want to be able to fix those concerns, and they want happy and healthy children. I mean, that is the one constant, no matter which parents I'm talking to. That's always the constant. Parents want their kids to be happy and healthy in life and be doing well. And so what ends up happening is the brain will mistake what is we say correlation, that these two things are related in some capacity, to a causation. This thing has caused this other thing to happen. And it's very easy to do. Everybody does it in different scenarios for different reasons. But what can happen is it can lead down that path where you're identifying a certain concern or an issue that may actually be not the root or not the cause. So correlation, two things are related, and then causation, one thing creates the other thing or kind of determines the other thing. So essentially is that it is very, in a nutshell, it is very common for children to struggle with transitioning between two houses. I would be hard pressed to find a child who doesn't struggle at all. So typically what it is that we're talking more so about the degree of which a child struggles to go back and forth, because anytime we have change in our life, it creates a small amount of stress. Right. And I don't know if anybody, out there listening today, or either the three of you can think about, how you start your day, depending on whether how routine it is versus how different or unexpected things happen in there. It will throw us off, right? We'll start to feel a little bit disjointed or disorganized, or, we might actually have, irritation and frustration. Those are all stress signs. And so even just getting up in the morning, putting on the appropriate clothes and getting, in front of your computer as we are today, is stressful. To some degree. It's just usually we've got enough of a rhythm that we don't notice the stress. But for children going between two homes, depending on the consistency between two homes versus how different those two homes are, depending on the relationship between all the different family members, depending on their own internal ability to adjust. These sometimes can unfortunately just pile up and compound upon each other. And so you will have, some children who going back and forth between two houses is difficult. And so what I would encourage parents listening today, if they're thinking, oh, that sounds like my child, instead of focusing on what the other parent may be doing or not doing, to really instead focus on what could help their child with that transition. Because rarely is it causational, where it is simply due to the fact that this other parent is doing something or not doing something. Usually there are a variety of reasons, and there are things that can be done, whether that's, helping the child practice calming exercises, whether that's validating the difficulty, validating the stress, planning something interesting or even low key for when they come back to your home. All of these little things can kind of help children go through that process and make that easier for them.
What kind of effect does conflict between the parents have on that phenomenon or of that stress level of the child when they're going back between house to house. And I guess what I mean is what this can sometimes spawn if the parents aren't careful. I don't know of any parent that really wants to put their child in the crossfire. I don't think that's very common. I think more commonly, they may not quite realize that they're putting the child in the crossfire. And so my question is, if they are making comments about this, that the child might overhear about, like, you know, this transition, how difficult it is, and putting the blame on the other parent, does that improve things?
Sorry, I don't mean to chuckle at that, but not typically. Not typically. Now, granted, you know, when you talk about people and you talk about, interactions, there are no hard and fast rules, but I would be hard pressed to find some family that has actually improved things, because children are naturally tuned in to their parents' emotions. That's something that is innate within humans. There's lots of lovely studies that look at the attachment between caregivers and infants, attunement styles, which just means that ability for a parent or like a caregiver, and an infant to kind of mirror each other with their verbalizations as well as with their emotional expressions. And we have that from the time that we're born. And so kids get really, really good, really, really fast reading their parents. And if anybody ever thinks about, when they were young, it can be really quick to know, oh, my mom is thinking this, or oh, my dad is feeling this, right? I think we all have stories of things that our parents have done, or times when we knew, trouble was coming because we did something and we got a certain look or a certain sigh, and we knew that we had gone too far. That's what kids do. And so they're constantly going to be reading that. And typically kids are incredibly empathetic, and they love their parents just as much as their parents love them. So they try to make things better. Right. And this is something that I do see come up a lot in my caseload, where you have a child essentially either changing their behavior to try to make their parents feel better, or what they think will make their parents feel better. Or you get sometimes questions that the children are asking that are not necessarily appropriate conversations to have with them. Or absolutely, like your example, you get a lot of really keen ears that are just around corners, that parents maybe think that, they're playing video games, or they're in their room, or, they're out in the backyard. But kids are, kind of eyes and ears everywhere in the house. So yes, parents do need to be very cautious and very careful, especially with information that is of an adult nature. There is this concept, or there's this term in family systems and family systems theory that talks about the intergenerational boundary that occurs between parents and children in a family system. And it's, kind of like this invisible or line between the two generations. And that line, especially when children are younger, tends to be a little bit more solid, a little bit more firm. And as kids get older, it can start to be a little bit more diffuse. You tend to share more information or more complex information with, say, teenagers versus children who are school-aged. But there are certain topics and certain pieces of information that do always need to stay above that generational, intergenerational boundary. And those would be exactly kind of what you mentioned, right? One parent's thoughts on another parent's parenting style, and or that other parent as a person, or situations that are definitely adult oriented orientated, I'm not too sure if that's the word, such as, court orders, lawyers meetings, judges meetings, all of those things really are for adults' ears and eyes only. And it really doesn't matter how old the child is, should not be shared with or questioned or talked about with children, because that just essentially bumps them above that intergenerational boundary and creates a considerable amount of stress and anxiety for them.
Yeah, that was my follow-up based on what you're saying is, okay, what happens if you do bump them up above there? And I mean, I think what a situation where this might commonly happen is, saying disparaging remarks about the other parent or parenting skills in front of the child, or that the child hears. And what you said, I think, is so important too, that you don't know, they're playing video games, they're not paying attention. Well, I don't know how much the brain's actually active while they're playing video games. I feel like it's more in a vegetative state, and they may be able to hear more than we think. So that suggests we need to be very careful as parents what we say around the house. But to the question, how can it affect the child, them hearing one parent say negative things about another parent?
Yeah. And there's really great, what we call longitudinal study in regards to this, which just means a study that they did over an incredibly long period of time, called the ACEs study. I don't know if people listening are familiar, if the three of you are familiar, but ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so they did this study over many decades about different adverse child experiences, which include things like conflict, include things like any kind of abuse, include things like what we typically would call transiency, or kind of instability of being able to be in one home at one time. People are moving in and out of that home, or homes are being left at a regular interval. All of those things are what we call adverse childhood experiences. And so they were able to identify over a child's lifetime what kinds of impacts various adverse childhood experiences have, and especially the more adverse childhood experiences that you have. So there's, I believe, 10 to 11 questions, or 10 to 11 things that can be identified with that questionnaire. And they did absolutely notice that if people had one or two experiences through their childhood years, that they were at an increased risk for certain. But if they started to have 3 to 5 to 6 of adverse childhood experiences, then that risk level dramatically increased. So the things that were affected were actually amazingly profound. It affected all sorts of areas of the children's lives going into adulthood. Their ability to have healthy relationships, whether or not they would finish certain levels of education, including high school or post-secondary, whether they would potentially have risks of struggling with any substances or alcohol use, as well as just physical components. One of the things that sometimes people tend to forget is that stress is exhibited physically in our bodies. And so people who had more amounts of adverse childhood experiences also tended to have hypertension, cholesterol issues, and they've actually linked those early experiences sometimes with premature death. So people didn't tend to live as long as their counterparts without those risks. There is actually a really wonderful resource called the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative. I hope I said that right. They have a wonderful website that actually has really great pieces of information as little videos, just talking about how brains are built and the impact of stress on those brains, as well as something that is being talked more and more about, which is called toxic stress. And toxic stress is something that is It's essentially stress situations that are too far out of a child's level of control and ability to manage. So something that is going on in the environment around them that they can't necessarily change, like separation and divorce. And if there is a lot of conflict related to that, how that kind of overwhelms their system over a long period of time and what that can actually do, which is essentially the basis of that ACEs study as well. So that's one of those things, right? Going back to that phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is, if you can, if somebody is going through a separation and divorce, if you can work on healthy patterns, healthy decisions, coping strategies, both for yourself and for your kids from the start, then typically those things are well managed, and it becomes something that that does not have a long-term negative effect on the children.
Parents do a lot about how to tell their kids that life is going to be changing. So separation is happening, divorce is happening. I think a lot of parents have different ways of communicating this information to kids, and maybe there's an age appropriateness to how you have those discussions. Do you have any thoughts on how to tell kids? Are there resources that people can read up on for age appropriate ways of communicating this information?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think typically does come up, and something to remember, is that not every adult exits a relationship at the same time or in the same way. And so that can make talking to the children quite difficult, because what one parent's narrative or story of what's going on in the relationship and the change that's going to happen in the family can differ a lot from the other parent's story or perception of what's going on. And that can be, or has the risk to be, confusing for children, especially younger children, who typically benefit from simple or simplified and clear explanations of what's going on. Sorry, it's a little bit difficult, because one thing that I do get asked sometimes from parents is, what should I say? What are the words? And that's very difficult, because there are no perfect words. I've never found them anyway, to tell kids about something difficult or something awkward or something that is changing in their lives. But there are some rules of thumb. So one of the rules of thumb is to agree on what the narrative or the story will be prior to talking to the kids. Being able to identify, like you said, age appropriate explanations, because again, what you're going to talk to, say, a 15-year-old about is going to be very different than what you're going to talk to a 5-year-old about. Something that I do typically talk to parents or tell parents to look at as a way to figure out if what they're saying is age appropriate or not, is to look at the types of books that their children are reading, and then to try to follow that storylines, word level, pacing, those kinds of things. If your child is young and they're still reading picture books with 1 to 2 sentences per page, then really what you're going to try to do is you're going to try to model that structure. If your child is older and they're reading chapter books that have complex storylines or multiple storylines that are all kind of weaving together, there's a good chance that you can have a more in-depth conversation, and you don't necessarily have to worry too much about those kinds of things. One of the ways, actually, it's a really nice little trick to see if the language that you're going to use is age appropriate, is you can always type it into a Word document, and then I think it's like if you do a word count, it will at the bottom give you a grade level score. And so if you type in, your father and I are getting a separation and we're going to be dividing the matrimonial assets, say, and you type that in there, there's a really good chance you're going to get a pretty high grade level score.
In fact, you just lost me there.
Exactly. So very clearly, you're not going to be having that type of conversation with anybody who is still in grade school at all. But if you have a grade 1 or grade 2 level vocabulary that you've typed in there and your child is in that age range, you're probably doing okay.
So can we try some examples of like, okay, here's something to say, and then you can kind of grade that on like, oh, the likelihood of that being a good thing to say.
Okay, what's the grade range? Am I doing like A, B, C, D?
No, not the. Well, sure, whatever way you want to rate it. So I'll give you one example, like where let's say the husband has been unfaithful, and then this could be something that the wife would say to the children. Well, Daddy's got a new girlfriend now. He's decided to leave our family. Or something along those lines.
Yeah.
What are the likelihoods of that being a good strategy?
Probably fairly low. But I'd like to pick apart that to explain why. Because again, I think for people to have understandings of why certain things would be more beneficial or less beneficial kind of helps guide their languages, or languaging, pardon me, because especially with younger children, you're going to have to talk to the kids multiple times. So there is no way of just saying that one thing and having the conversation be done. So one of the elements of what you said, Evan, is, Daddy has left our family. And really that's very much a perspective from the marital relationship and not actually from the family relationship, right? Children don't divorce their parents. And that just doesn't happen. So from the child's perspective, their family actually has not changed in its components. It's only changed in its living structures. One of the things, and any client or I guess lawyer who has worked with me knows that I typically call separated or divorced families 2 household families. And that's done very purposefully because that's the child's reference. Their family has not changed. Mom is still mom, dad is still dad, sister or brother is still sister or brother. It's just they happen to live in 2 households now instead of 1. And I commonly tell kids, I'm kind of unique. I have a 4 household family, just simply because, of course, myself and my siblings and my parents are all grown up now. And so we just happen to live in 4 separate households, but they're still my family. And it's just kind of provides that a little bit of parallel or reference. The other part is in regards to introducing new family members, potentially. With your example, it's kind of nice that the mom didn't talk about the infidelity. That's kind of a good thing. But also introducing partners this is why
you slept with someone, that would be bad to get into those kinds of details?
Absolutely. And it goes back, essentially, all of those elements go back to that intergenerational boundary. All of those events occurred within the marital relationship. And so therefore is adult content. And so really the main piece of information that any child, no matter what their age, really needs to know about changes in their family structure, or if where parents will be living, is that their relationships are still secure and stable. So something like your father and I have decided that we're not going to live in the same house anymore. We're going to do what's called a separation. But I want you to know your dad still loves you very much, and so do I. And we're still going to be your mom and dad, and that part will never change, right? Just redirect away from adult content and focus on what your child actually needs to hear, which is reassurance and messages of love and messages of stability, which I understand can be very difficult for parents to do. especially when they're feeling overwhelmed, when they're emotionally hurting. It is a very, very tall order, but very important at the same time.
Sure. I was just thinking that, like, even that language of leaving could be so scary for a child, right? They that might bring out feelings for them, like, well, what if he decides to leave me? What if I'm being left behind? And those kinds of things. Brandy, what if, I've got, I get asked this quite often, or this comment made to me is people will say, I did some Google research and I think my ex is a narcissist.
No, you
right?
hear that from time to time?
And there are narcissists out there, but I think what they commonly are getting at is this person's very difficult to communicate with, that, they maybe don't trust what's going on in the other home. And then I think what ends up happening in those situations is that parent is desperately trying to get information or communicate, and then that ends up leaching into conversations with the kids and that kind of thing. So I know that's sort of a specific question in a way, but like, what would you suggest to that parent? Like, what kind of supports can they get, or what kind of things can they do on their side of the equation if you've got no buy-in from the other, from the other half?
Yeah. You know what? It's really interesting. Some of the things that I talk to children about a lot are things that are inside their control and things that are outside of their control. But that conversation parallels considerably to a lot of situations as adults, right? I mean, so just humans in general tend to become more frustrated, more overwhelmed, and have a lot harder time managing and coping with things that are outside of their control. I think all you need to do is look at the state of the world right now and the pandemic that we're currently dealing with to know that that can be incredibly difficult because we have limited influence. Right? So typically what I talk to children about, what I would talk to that parent about in particular, and what I have been talking to a lot of clients about in regards to the pandemic currently is search for what is in your control. There are always things within our control. And if we can shift our focus, ask ourselves on a regular basis, what can I do in this moment? Not necessarily what can I do about my co-parent? What can I do about the fact that the children eat jelly beans and hot dogs at their pace? Not what can I do about what the lawyer is going to say? Just what can I do in this moment? Because at the root of every situation, we all have the control over our own minds, over our own feelings, and over our own actions. And sometimes the thing that we can do is very small. Sometimes the thing that we can do is just close our eyes and take 5 deep breaths. But it will shift the situation. It will shift that person's ability to cope, that person's ability to think clearly. Like, there is always something, but sometimes we have to search really hard for it. Sometimes it has to be small. So if there is the scenario where somebody is co-parenting with somebody who is difficult, who has rigid communication styles or rigid thought patterns, who is kind of high conflict or focuses a lot of things on themselves, then it's what can you do in this situation, not what is your co-parent doing or not doing. What can you do? And hopefully that helps to create a little bit more feeling of control, a little bit more feeling of mastery or power in the situation, and can open up some options. There are also some really great resources in that area. One author in particular does some really amazing work when it comes to conflict communication, both in separation and divorce, but also just in general life and work scenarios as well. And that person, his name is Bill Eddy. And I got to give a shout out. He's Canadian as well, which is lovely.
He's the best.
He is. And I can never remember if he was a lawyer first and then a social worker, or a social worker first and then a lawyer. But it's kind of interesting that he has a foot in both camps, because I think that allows him to give a lot of really great information and great perspective on all of those different communication styles. So Bill Eddy is a great resource. I think it's High Conflict Institute, I believe, is his website. But if you just Google Bill Eddy, you will definitely find him. And he's got some really concrete, really action-oriented books that can help anybody who is struggling with communication with somebody else, not just in a parent-to-parent situation.
Yeah, he's got some pretty good sort of even one-pager resources, like the BIF response for emailing. Some, what's the other thing? I think you might have mentioned it in your notes. The what's your proposal approach to things? Just really helpful things that are like in that column, right? In the you can control column. So you're never going to be able to control the other side, but sometimes the things that you do can have effects on other people as well, right? So
absolutely. One of the things that he talks a lot about, and I can't remember exactly which book, but that he does talk a lot about, is that any kind of communication starts with you. Right? If anybody is going into an interaction, but they're feeling stressed, they're feeling overwhelmed, and their fight or flight response is turned on, it's just going to be way more difficult to think clearly, make appropriate decisions. It's very easy to be blindsided in difficult communication or highly conflictual communication. People tend to put out what I call like emotional hooks. So they're kind of like the red herrings of the conversation. So maybe one parent emails another parent about pickup times for the children. They've got to change it from 4 to 5 or something like that. And then all of a sudden, everybody like takes a quick blink and they're frantically emailing back and forth about who the dog loves more, or, why did the vacation in Hawaii fall apart? And it's like, how did we get here? Right. It's that, taking care of your own emotions, taking the slow and steady approach is going to help essentially avoid all of that additional concern and conflict. So, yeah.
It's such good and poignant advice to deal with stress. What you just said about focusing on our own circle of influence. Nothing causes us stress more, I think, than things we can't control and not being happy with how that's going. That's super stressful to me. Like if I start focusing on things I can't control, and for example, sports. Sports produce such extreme emotions in people. There's people in Europe, especially England, are known for having these hooligan soccer fans that lose all control.
Yes.
They have riots, they have big fights and stuff like this. And it's all related to pinning so much emotion on something you have absolutely zero control over.
Yeah.
And I don't know why we love it, but we love it.
Well,
I thought you were able to control the outcome of a game depending on which sock you put on first. Isn't that? I thought you could.
Actually, I haven't tried that one yet, Heather. I'm going to try that one tomorrow.
Sorry, Brandy.
No, that's totally fine. But it is. It's what is that called? The double-edged sword, right? Is that anything that's emotionally engaging is going to be invested in by people, right? And when we have our team and our team is doing something, right, that we have this, kind of perception that we're part of that. And it stimulates things like pride and excitement and, happiness and belonging and community. And all of those things are wonderful, wonderful things. when your team is doing well.
Well,
And then when they're not, unfortunately, you get the other types of emotional engagements, which is, anger and frustration and shame and blaming and, all of those other things, which kind of takes a pretty sharp turn to the left sometimes. So yeah, that's what we do.
I don't know if you guys know about this, but Constantinople, back in the day, their big thing was chariot races, and there was 4 teams that were different colors. I think it was red, green, blue. I don't know what the 4th color was, but they white. I think the 4th one was white, and they that was how they identified, those different colored groups started wielding political power, and they were mobocracies and stuff. And then you look at Montreal in the 50s when Rocket Richard was suspended right as he was about to take the scoring championship, which he never did, from Gordie Howe. And you look at Montreal in 1993 when they won the Stanley Cup, there was riots. You look at Vancouver in 1994 when they lost, and then 2011 again when they also lost, both riots in the city because of hockey.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And we're not immune to that either.
Yeah.
I can't remember the year of it because I'm so sorry, Evan, but I'm not a huge sports fan. But I do recall one time trying to return to my apartment that was just off of White Avenue. One of the years that the Oilers either won or lost. I think it was the lost part of it. And
2005 or something when they went all the way to the final, I believe.
That would have, I'll be honest, that timeline would have been probably exactly around that I would have been living in the area. And when I went to work the following day, excuse me, there were, bus enclosures smashed out and everything else over a hockey game. And Calgary, I think, was famous for a considerable amount of years for their Red Mile and, right. How that city would react versus for wins versus losses. So.
And so to bring it back, when you were talking about that, it reminded me of, I love Stephen R. Covey and his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the stories he shares in there is the story of Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl, for anyone that doesn't know, I'm not going to go into all the details of the story, but he was in a Jewish concentration camp in World War II. And he just, as he was at a low point, naked and beaten, he realized that there was one thing they couldn't take from him, and that was his mind. And he could control himself. And he made a decision then to choose to act instead of just to react. And he is a great story of hope, and people around him lived longer and survived, and that power. It's just such a good extreme example of how when we focus on what we can control, then our circle of influence actually ends up growing, and we can have such great effects on the world and change the world. Whereas if we focus on things we can't control and become bitter and sour, then it shrinks and we lose influence. And so that applies certainly to when a relationship is breaking down, we're going through difficult traumatic times in our life associated with that. Especially when you're losing influence over that person who is having such an influence over you in a negative way, to kind of remember to, okay, let's just focus on, what I can control? I can control, we talked about stress of getting changed. I can control getting changed in the morning. I can control, it starts small. And I think, I don't know, hopefully that can be helpful.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, if I can add on another and hopefully poignant lesson from Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning, is that he also, because he realized, or within the realization that his mind was still uniquely his own, he started to create meaning. Why am I doing this? What is the purpose? What is my goal at the end of all this? Because absolutely, he could not control what was going on around him at the time. Mm-hmm. But he kept in his mind his desire to reconnect, I believe, it's been many years since I've read that book, but I believe it was with his wife. After everything was over, I'm going to reconnect with my wife. And that was the drive. That was the goal that kept him going. It was like kind of his carrot throughout that entire experience, which I could only imagine being incredibly difficult to live day to day. And so that's very much the same, right? Is that when families are going through change and there's a lot of uncertainty, and what is this going to look like, and how are things going to be decided, and what can I do, and are my kids going to be okay, right? I talk to parents about, at the end of the day, what do you want your children to remember? What do you want your life or their life to be like, way, way, way beyond what's going on right now? And that can be, I talk to parents a lot of times needing a yardstick. Everybody needs their yardstick, because in the moment where things are constantly shifting and there's so many different elements of change, it can be very easy to, take a sharp right or a sharp left, and later on not want to go down that path. So I have a question when I'm first starting to interview parents. I have a question that I always tack on to the end. And I always say this comes with a little bit of a story. I have an older sibling who's married, and at his wedding, there was a lot of speeches. I love my brother very much. We're very different people sometimes, though. I had a very casual kind of wedding, and he had a very formalized wedding with lots of speeches. And I got to give this speech that I lovingly refer to as Ode to My Parents. But it was essentially talking about, what my parents have taught me, what I'll always remember them for, what I have valued about their parenting, and, kind of who they were to my siblings and I growing up. And I always tell parents, think of that. Like, let's fast forward. One of your children is getting married and wants a really formal wedding with lots of speeches. And the other one is tasked with telling this. Like, what do you want to be in there? What do you want your children to remember and to say about your parenting and the joint parenting throughout their entire lives? And that's the yardstick, because I've never had a parent come back and say, I don't really care. It doesn't really matter to me whether they liked their childhood or didn't like their childhood. Like I say, all parents want their kids to be happy and healthy and to be doing well. And that's got to be kept at the forefront of the brain.
Including your ex.
Yes, joint parenting. What do you want the parents to be remembered for? Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I meant what you were saying is all parents love their children, and sometimes I've seen my clients get to a place where they maybe start allowing themselves to think that's not true about the other parent.
Oh, I see. Yes.
But of course, it is true about the other parent. All parents love their children. They're trying to do their best, usually.
Yeah.
I love that story, Brandy, too, because I think it takes you to that 10,000 foot view as well, of sort of thinking like, what's the big picture I'm aiming for here? Like, I'm a human, I'm going to misstep. I'm probably going to sometimes not say the right thing, but generally speaking, what's the goal that I'm aiming for towards, and measuring yourself against that. So that there's, that big picture thinking. I really like that. I think that's quite lovely.
Yeah. And I think that's a really great point, Heather, is that just like there's no perfect words, there are no perfect ways to be a parent. A lot of times, and I'll be honest, sometimes what ends up being a component of why the marriage is dissolving is just competing values. But it doesn't mean that the other person's values are not valid and not potentially beneficial. They just don't necessarily line up, or the priority of them doesn't line up with maybe with the other parents. Meaning, the opposites attract. Very common. It can be very common to have one parent value spontaneity and being in the moment and going with the flow and taking what life gives you. and the other parent to value structure and routine and expectations and consistency, in reality, children benefit from both of those things when they're done in balance. Right. But absolutely, I can understand and I can see how over time parents become more and more polarized, and they try to compensate for the other parent by becoming more structured and routined and more spontaneous and in the moment. And unfortunately, it's the polarization that can have a negative effect on children. Whereas exactly that, if you can remember, like, all of this can benefit our children, that hopefully a balance can be struck in some way.
Sorry, I was going to say, I have people who reach out to me quite often, and they say, well, my kid is going to therapy, or my ex is going to take them to therapy. I don't know what's happening there. How do I get involved? And I was curious more on the operational side of things. What does the process look like for both parents being involved in that therapy? And what is therapy for little kids?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a large question. So I'm going to just break it down a little bit. Is that typically the therapy itself looks different based on the age and developmental stage of the child. So typically children who are, kind of under 12, there's usually some elements of play. There's some elements of activity-based interventions, because as all parents are aware, if you try to sit your young child down and have an hour-long conversation with them, you will lose them after 10 minutes and nothing gets in. So there are different therapeutic, kind of orientations and trainings and what have you in order to work with young children. But usually it's activity based. With really young children, it's a little bit. It tends to be fully activity based or heavily activity based, and then you kind of start to get into more talk based therapies and talk therapies, children hit teenage years and what have you. So that's what typically people would think of when you think of therapy. They think of sitting on a couch and talking with somebody, but that's more so adult types of therapy and maybe teenagers. So there is a wide range of things. My office, I think you can see a little bit of my bookshelf in the video here, but my office is also a playroom, and so there are lots of different things in there to be creative with and toys to play with and explore with and whatnot, and that's typical of anyone who works with young children. Now, in terms of operations, there are some hard and fast rules of what is required of me because I'm a registered psychologist, but then there's also typically what I have adopted into my practice. So of course, anytime you work with a minor, you do need to have parental consent. One of the things that I have incorporated into my practice through experience and best practice kind of thought process is I have joint parental consent of any family that is a two-household family. And that means meeting with both parents, talking together with all of the adults. So, all the emails that I send to both parents, and I get parents to send me information, copying the other parent, essentially so that everybody can have an awareness of what's going on and an understanding. I find that this is incredibly helpful, especially with younger children, because if we're talking about any kind of strategies that they need to use at home or things that they need to practice, I really do need that parental support to cue them and to remind them and to help them do anything like that at home. So I think it's really important. But one of the other things, especially with, like I say, registered psychologists, which is what I can speak to because that's my background, is that all guardians of a child receiving therapy services from a registered psychologist does have what we call right to access to information. And so if, if you have a situation like that, or if anybody is telling you, yeah, they're going to see this psychologist, but I don't know what's going on, or I can't get any information, then I would say tell them to keep trying, either with the therapist or the psychologist directly, or to contact, because we're registered professionals, you can contact our college as well to see what the obligations of the psychologist are. Because parents typically do want to know what's going on with their child in therapy, and how they can help, and what kind of important pieces of information they need to know.
Brandy, what kind of information could a parent expect to be getting from you about what's going on in therapy? Like, if you have that like that example that I used before, where your other your ex-spouse isn't communicating well with you, can you expect after a few sessions, Brandy's going to call you up and say, yeah, no, he's really being a jerk. So I confirm that through the kid, and he should get less time. Like, what kind of reporting are you getting from working with the child? I'm being a little facetious there. I appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
I was like, those are the clinical terms,
Well, to be clear, that is what some clients definitely are hoping to get back.
Yes, absolutely. And that is a lot of the education that I do with parents about the limitations of my role, because absolutely, depending on who exactly I'm working with, I can provide different levels or different types of feedback. If I'm working individually with a child, I can give feedback about that child. One of the kind of really strong and hard rules when working with, therapists is we really can only give feedback in regards to people who we have worked with directly. There are also some pretty hard and fast rules about specifically recommendations or opinions or feedback about parenting time. There is one situation, essentially, because parenting time, parenting responsibilities and whatnot is such a significant area to comment on. It is only when something called a bilateral custody assessment has been completed.
Sorry, Brandy, can you say that again? Lottery kind of got
cut out.
Bilateral.
Okay. A bilateral custody assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So if you are assessing specifically custody, or what is now very much called parenting time, then you can comment on it. But really, other than that, you cannot. Even with other types of court-ordered interventions and what have you, that's still very that's not appropriate to do. So that's why there's lots of other types of assessments and interventions. So in my practice, I do not necessarily related to situations of separation and divorce, but I do psychoeducational assessments. And so in those ways, because I have done the specific information gathering about a child's state of mind and how they're doing in school, their cognition, I can talk about it. But if I was seeing a child for therapy, for example, I couldn't necessarily talk about their cognition because I just wouldn't have that information. So it's that whole idea is that, if I'm working individually with a child, I really cannot comment on a parent as a person, that's for sure. Yeah. But potentially I could comment on the child's interpretations or impact of certain situations on the child, those kinds of things. But it's always done from the reference point of my client. And if my client is the child, that's got to be the reference point. If I'm working with both parents, or if I'm working with an entire family together, then I can speak a little bit more so to the interactional patterns or impact of one person to another person, because I'm actually engaged and gathering information and have an ability to assess all of those different elements. But that's really impossible when you have one solitary client.
Okay. I think that's really helpful and good information to know.
I've got a hard question. So so a lot of psychology is paid out of pocket. So group benefits plans rarely cover what is needed to help people out. So there's people out there who know that their kids need help. They know that they want to find somebody just like you, but they don't have the money to do it. So my first question is, how do they find help? And the second question is, what could they expect for costs? Are kids, is their therapy any cheaper than what it would cost for an adult?
Yes, there definitely are. And just sometimes you're absolutely right, Kim. I mean, unfortunately, sometimes it is what we call like a buyer beware situation. And so there are definitely agencies that are out there that provide therapy services that have some sort of a subsidized cost. So they'll either offer a sliding fee scale, or they will have some additional funding that doesn't come directly from a client. So places like the Family Center, Catholic Social Services, they are also funded through their charitable organizations, and so they can provide services at a much lower cost. But I would encourage people to ask whichever therapist, whether you know if they're a registered psychologist or a registered social worker, clinical social worker, or whichever, ask them about their background and their training. Sometimes I've gotten the feedback, it can sometimes be a little bit awkward to say like, well, what are your areas of expertise and how long have you been practicing, and do you work with situations that are similar to ours? But it is absolutely appropriate. And whichever therapist that you are engaging should be able to answer all of those questions. No one can be the perfect therapist for everybody, and we all have our areas that we typically work in or our limitations. And it's up to jointly between the therapist and the client to make sure that things are a good fit. If a child is not comfortable with that individual, if it feels like they maybe don't have as much experience that's kind of needed for the situation, then it's absolutely appropriate to kind of shop around and to call a few different people. Having said that, specifically for separation and divorce, there are some additional resources that are out there. Unfortunately, right now with COVID and what have you, are somewhat limited, but there are actually groups for children that have been running to various degrees. Like I say, I think right now it's a little bit difficult because I don't know how many of them have moved online. But that can be also a really wonderful way to get your children support and have it be cost effective. So one of the groups that I'm familiar with, which is kind of like an oldie but a goodie, is the Rainbows program. The Rainbows program, it looks at, it's a grief and loss program. So sometimes there are children in those groups that their parents are not necessarily going through a divorce, but they are, somebody has passed away. Or something like that. But because separation and divorce is addressed a lot of times with children in a similar framework, the grief and losses, it does work well together. So those are pretty site specific in terms of whether or not they've gone online or if they've kind of like halted in this moment due to COVID restrictions. But that's something that exists out there for sure. There's also a group that I recently, with a colleague of mine, ran a group with. I say recently, but this is pre-COVID, and it's called the CODIP group. And so that is something actually that is specific for children who are going through separation and divorce. So it is unique to that group, and it looks at building up skills of resiliency for children that are experiencing separation and divorce. So so there are resources out there in a group format. And typically the group format can support a reduced cost, because then, of course, it's the time and the resources and the energies that all need to go into that is kind of dispersed amongst the participants.
So what is the cost for a registered psychologist specializing with children? Like a range? Is there a range? Because our listeners will want to know, so they can put it in a budget.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple different ways, and again, it's a little bit different when it comes to private practice, because businesses are able to set their own rates. So I'm going to speak very generally, but I would also absolutely encourage listeners to call around and to ask what different agencies' rates are. But we have what's called the PAA, the Psychologists Association of Alberta, and they put out recommended rates for therapy services and things like that. So if it's general therapy for a child, the PAA recommended rate right now is $200 per session or per hour. Now, again, some agencies will just have a sliding fee scale. My agency for general therapy does offer a sliding fee scale. So part of our intake process is to ask what the household income is to determine that fee. But we also have certain specific areas that are considered specialized. So not necessarily all the time when we're working with children directly, but if we're working with a family who is going through a specific divorce process, like a collaborative family law process or something like that, we do have an elevated rate. And that at this point is $275 per session. And then we do have what we call a psycho-legal fee. And so if there does need to be quite a formalized process that is, has court involvement and court orders and what have you, then there is a specific rate for that as well, which is $350 pending per hour. So really what it is that's that early intervention, that ability to keep the conflict down, to stay out of formalized processes within the legal system, then usually the lower cost that there is.
Mm-hmm. Do you work with benefits providers? I know, Kim, you did mention that some benefit plans do cover some costs for counseling and therapy.
Somewhat. So, meaning that, a registered psychologist would always be recognized by benefit plans as long as there's something in there that like a portion of that we would be covered by. So in benefit plans in Alberta, psychologists are covered by anything that identifies as psychological services, as well as anything that identifies as health spending accounts, as well as anything that's identified as wellness spending accounts. So definitely it's really important for people to get to know their policy and get to know their benefits plan, because if any or all three of those are included in somebody's extended healthcare benefits, then that's what a psychologist can be claimed under. Now, there are also a lot of social workers and clinical social workers that work in this area, and that can be a little bit more variable from plan to plan. So again, double check your benefits plan to see. A lot of agencies do direct bill so that clients aren't necessarily paying out of pocket each time. usually, you can use up your benefits and then have a fee after that.
Right.
But the other piece of information that sometimes people are not aware of is that for social workers as well as for registered psychologists, we are what's considered medical expenses underneath people's tax preparation or tax situation. So if there's the need for especially intensive or long-lasting therapeutic services, we always tell people save your receipts and then apply them on your taxes come April. And then depending on the situation, depending on all of the nitty-gritties with that, sometimes it can make a bit of difference as well.
Right, get you over that minimum amount that you need to claim or add to it. Great. Those are all super tips to make that a little more financially accessible for folks.
Yeah, and I do think that is definitely a difficult thing for people is, psychology being how it is. Benefit plans can differ vastly. So unfortunately, I have had some clients come in and they have maybe enough for 1 or 2 sessions under their benefit plans, and I have other people that their benefit plans are significant and they're able to pay pretty much most of it through there and have very little coming out of their own pocket. So one of the pieces, and then this is going to be absolutely a little bit of just general psychology soapbox standing, but it's really important for people to advocate with their employers as well. Mental health and good mental health is something that we're talking more and more about these days, but sometimes isn't still translating into resources. And so if people look at their benefit plans and are noticing that really there's not a lot in there in terms of mental health supports and other medical needs that employees have, then the idea is to, talk with your employer, talk with, whoever's in HR, and when that benefit plan can be renegotiated, to make sure that that's highlighted, that that's something that is needed and needs to be advocated for, because it can be developed and it can be part of extended healthcare plans. But I think it's one of those situations, unfortunately, you don't know that you need it until you need it. And then you have to deal with what you have. Yeah.
And then you realize, it's not there, or it's limited, for sure.
Yeah, don't get me started about insurance companies. Fair
enough.
I learned some pretty shocking things on our last episode about insurance, so I don't know if I'm ready for another insurance conversation this week.
Randy makes a good point, though. I sell group benefits. It's part of my offering with people, and having a good group benefits person as your advocate is really important for a company, because they'll educate the employers on what other people are doing and what their options are. And a lot of small businesses don't know what questions to ask. So, if employees are going to the boss and saying, hey, I need this stuff, the boss will note that for their renewal, and they can talk about it with their group benefits provider, maybe think about adding it in and taking other things off the list that aren't as used. So I think that's a great point. Maybe one day we'll have a group benefits person, a specialist on our program, to talk a little bit how to maneuver that and add psychology to that.
Look, any of our listeners out there own a small business and they employ people and they have a corporation, just get a private health services plan. I don't know if you deal with that at all, Kim, but that allows you just to have an amount, and your employees can use it for whatever services they want. They can use it towards orthodontry. They can use it towards whatever. And then once it's used up, so that you can set it to be $1,000 or $2,000. Premiums for insurance companies are crazy. Usually it's in the range of $170 to $300 per month, both the employee and the employer's portion. So if you just put $500 to $700 a month towards a private health services plan, there's so much more opportunity to get value out of that. And premiums don't go up.
The tough thing is that there's no one size fits all for every employer.
So that's it. I just said that's the size that fits all, Kim.
I like your thinking, Evan, but unfortunately there are other elements that
Fine.
that not to be the case always.
Fine. Anyways, Brandy, it has been a pleasure having you on here, getting to know you and sharing in your vast wealth of knowledge. We really appreciate it, and it certainly, as lawyers, we often, I feel confident saying, Heather does this as well, let people know that I'm expensive and not a very good psychologist. So your money is better spent going to see Brandy about those types of issues than me. I can help you with the law. That's it.
Yeah.
So hearing from you is great, and you offer a service that certainly. I think everybody who's going through a divorce is such a traumatic experience. Everybody going through that should be looking for other resources to help them as well, like yourself, than just lawyers, because lawyers, we're good for some things, not everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, and I can appreciate that for sure. There's been definitely more than one time in conversations that I will utter the phrase, "That sounds like a legal question." I'm not the person to ask that question to. But yeah, absolutely. I guess it's one of those things, if I can, kind of just going up based on what you just said, add a little bit for the listeners, is that I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of moments where people are looking for therapeutic kind of outcomes, healing, emotional kind of goals to be met in the wrong system. I see this clients who are seeking that within the criminal justice system, as well as within family law as well. And unfortunately, it's just the wrong system to meet that need. And so, there needs to be something else in order to get that outcome.
Yeah, every tool has their place. You can't just use a sledgehammer for everything. A sledgehammer does not make a great paintbrush, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah. Kim, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, this is really great. Brandy, I appreciate how generous you were with the information you shared. I had a series of questions and you just kind of kept knocking them off as you went through. And I know there's, the most important person in many people's lives are their kids. And I think people are going to be really interested to hear what you had to say today. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, and we should just restate my comments about insurance are my opinion, not Kim's. Kim has very strict compliance that she's got to follow within, so we just want to make that disclaimer very clear.
And Kim can definitely analyze your situation and let you know what the best option might be for you in your business.
Heard my opinion, but I'm not a financial advisor, so maybe take it with a grain of salt. Heather, any closing thoughts from you?
Oh, just thanks so much for your time and generosity, Brandy. It's always a pleasure. You always have some interesting, really interesting nuggets that stick with me. And go read Man's Search for Meaning. It's so good. It's one of the books I go back to probably once a year, once every 2 years. It's amazing.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Brandy. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Access to Justice, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Streets and time.
Any information in this video is general information only and is not, nor is it intended to be, legal advice. Watching this video does not create a lawyer-client relationship. You should always seek the advice of a lawyer or other qualified professional for advice regarding your individual situation. While we take care to ensure that the information contained in this video is accurate and up to date, we make no warranties or representations as to the suitability, completeness, or accuracy of the information contained in this video. Any reliance you place on the information is at your own risk. Kahane Law Office, Merrick Law, Heather Malarick Professional Corporation, Evan Clark Professional Corporation, Evan Clark, Heather Malarick, and any guests will not be responsible nor liable in any way for any content, including but not limited to any errors or omissions in the content, or for any loss or damage of any kind incurred as a result of any content communicated in this video, whether by Evan Clark, Heather Malarick, or by a third party. Kim Mcdonald is a financial advisor with Raymond James Limited. Information provided is not a solicitation, and although obtained from sources considered reliable, is not guaranteed. The view and opinions contained in this media are those of Kim Mcdonald, not Raymond James Limited. Securities-related products and services are offered through Raymond James Limited, member Canadian Investor Protection Fund. Insurance products and services are offered through Raymond James Financial Planning Limited, which is not a member Canadian Investor Protection Fund. Raymond James advisors are not tax advisors, and we recommend that clients seek independent advice from a professional advisor on tax-related matters.
Stole my heart from my lips. That was it. Didn't get this